Welcome back. This is Chapter 10, Episode 2, and we're talking about gender roles and constructing our ideas of masculine and feminine. So what we consider masculine and feminine differs across cultures, like I said before, and gender displays can vary dramatically. Certainly, what is considered masculine in the 1950s or 1980s or 2014 or 2020, all quite different, right? But in all cultures, there are certainly pressures to conform to these gender roles. And really how we understand these gender roles is we learn them like over and over and over, and we learn them through social interaction. And through that social interaction, it leaves room sort of for renegotiating what those means and challenges to those. It was a big challenge, apparently, to gender roles in 1992, my senior year, when I had an earring. I don't think anybody really bats an eye nowadays at that. How many years ago was that? 20-some years ago? 18 years ago? Oh, no, 20 years ago? Anyway, not a big challenge nowadays, but that's the kind of thing we're talking about. It can be as insignificant as a pinpoint. I think my ear's still pierced twice. Once, twice? Anyway. All right, patriarchy, matriarchy, and sexism. Talk about these systems. Real simply, patriarchy, a form of social organization in which men dominate females. We're in that scenario right now in the United States in the year 2020. We've been in that scenario ever since the conception of the United States in this culture, but that it's not necessarily true for every culture and certainly not throughout history. Matriarchy, a form of social organization in which females dominate males. And in many parts of the world today, there are cultures where the women walk miles and miles for water, and they do the child rearing, and they prepare and collect the food, except for maybe a small amount of hunting. And anyway, taking on a majority of the weight in those organizations or in those forms of societies. And sexism, the belief that one's sex is innately superior to the other, and that one's gender is superior to the other, and oftentimes seen as innately the word there, but just this is the way it should be, right? We understand who's most fit to lead, and it's sort of natural that way, just like we sort of happen to have those same individuals say, and also those people of European descent. But of course, when you're structuring a society, you're going to try and structure it to benefit you, and oftentimes to disadvantage others. All right, we're going to look at a map now here that shows greater variation in relative power and privilege of women that exists from country to country, just to show that we are truly all over the place on a global scale. Australia, Iceland, Norway give women the highest social standing, some of the most sought-after countries to live, some of the countries with the best health statistics, and some of the most equal social standing. And in contrast to women in Central African Republic, Sierra Leone, Mali, and Afghanistan, they have much lower social standing compared to men in those countries. Of course, this is all relative, right? I didn't include our name in that group, even though it's a little blurry, but if you look at women's social standing, high comparatively, but I think a lot of people who identify with the gender female would say, no, we shouldn't be in that category, not even above average. So I guess, it depends on exactly how we're measuring this across the board and what we're looking at. Certainly access to working and healthcare and decision-making in politics. And of course, the United States, just not there, might even venture to say that at this point, considering political elections and administrations, we are far more as a nation prejudiced and discriminatory towards women than we are even towards people of color. I think that the last election really came out and showed just how little power, or just how little power folks who oppress would like to make sure that women stay, or people who identify as gender female would like to stay in. So again, we might disagree with these breakdowns. Have you experienced gender inequality at CSU? Yes, no, yes, but very subtle. Every semester we have an alarming number of students, when I ask this question, who have experienced gender inequality at CSU, and will continue to do so until we get better as an institution, until students demand more, teachers and faculties demand more, and administration demands more equity and equality. All right, a couple questions to think of. What advantages do you have because of your gender? And then, conversely, what disadvantages do you have because of your gender? This is a really wide-ranging scope of possibilities here. All right. How is it that we learn about gender? Because we know that we are socialized. It's not as much about biology as it is about social learning and social construction. Really, we learn about gender from before birth. I've got birth to death before birth, because this didn't used to be a thing. When I was a kid, you didn't get an ultrasound. It was a very rare thing. And we have to understand that ultrasounds are military technology. They're very, very invasive. And there's some interesting and sad data as we look at the more and more and more ultrasounds that people are tending to have, and the impact that that has on children, learning capabilities, and development. All very interesting stuff to look at. But we decide early on nowadays, very early on, to get an ultrasound. And I guess, because I don't really connect with this, you could tell by the way I'm talking, I guess so that we can paint the room blue, buy certain types of clothes, and really just prepare ourselves for that. But I never really saw what good in that there was to begin with. When the boys were born, or before Storm was born, I painted his room blue with green rolling hills, Winnie the Pooh, and we were ready for anything. But certainly not ready to assign pre even to birth a gender. Peer group schooling, mass media, social interactions, all those. We learn what female attributes are, what male attributes are, and what these gender roles are to be. And that would be attributes and activities that a society links to each sex are our gender roles. And just like we talked about agents of socialization earlier, we can get into really a more specific piece with gender. Children learn a great deal about socially normative gender roles from their families, particularly from their parents. We begin to treat their children differently before birth now, like I said, based on their child's gender. And sons, we tend to give wings to, right? Taught to compete or complete tasks on their own, to go out and be as independent as possible. When boys are born, or we perceive them to be boys, right from birth, we tend to actually throw them up in the air. We talk much louder to them. We're rougher with them. Even though they're this tiny little thing that just got out in the world, we are much rougher with them right out of the gate if we perceive them to be a son, gender male. Daughters, we encourage them to get roots, to ask for help, for someone else to complete a task. And we know with how we deal with babies that we actually hold them closer, we hold them softer, and we talk to them in ways that are much different than baby boys. Anyway, all of these ways that we socialize our kids, and people really, for the most part, unconscious about it. Even if they like get the kid a little plastic gun, paint the room blue, buy a bunch of Camel, and they're like, "Who's my little man?" It's, you know, it's just like this 7-pound creature. It's overt, and people still might not realize it, because that is the advantage of being in a dominant gender. Oftentimes, you just don't have to think about what that means. Friends and peers, beginning at an early age. Girls and boys learn stereotypical gender roles. What kind of games are you playing out on the playground? Is it the difference between kickball and football and dodgeball, or playing house, or playing monkey bars and playing jump rope, right? We engage in gender policing, stigmatizing, and certainly those that perform gender roles incorrectly, meaning, you know, if we see somebody cry, and this is like I had mentioned before in one of the lectures, I cannot tell you the amount of times that I saw a mom pick up their little boy, dust him off, and say, "No crying, be a man." So when people perform their gender roles incorrectly, we let people know about it. It continues in a high school, college, and beyond with stereotypical gender behavior that's enforced in sports teams, sororities, fraternities, other social groups, you name it. So, good question here. What did you learn from your friends or your peers about gender? And it could be something really positive. It could be something really stereotypical. Anyway, that's everybody's individual experience. Women are a majority of the student body now in colleges. They are also graduating at a higher rate with higher grades. They are present in many fields of study that previously excluded them. Men are still, for the meantime, predominant in many, many fields. But again, that's a function of, to a certain degree, privilege and just the access that you might have based on your gender, whether or not you were working as hard or had as many obstacles in your way. High school, I think that's interesting. Anytime we get to a hidden curriculum, right? Those unspoken socializations, norms, values, and roles, including gender roles that occur in the classroom itself. Obviously, our history textbooks are severely outdated in this country, dominated not only by male figures, but a whole lot of fairy tale type of historical revisionist type of behavior as well. Girls outperform boys in terms of grades, enrollment in AP courses, graduation rates. And then we get back to gender bias testing, where boys, up until recently, consistently outperform girls on the SAT. That's changing to a large degree as well. That is how, again, privilege sort of undermines you. The less hard you have to work to attain the same status, after a while, that's not an advantage. It's a serious disadvantage. All right. Check out this video. We know that pretty early on, we have ideas about race, and we have very strong ideas in our head as we're socialized in very subtle ways and some very not so subtle ways into these roles. We could look at the representation of men and women in the media, this expected image of the eating disorder. Check out the video. It's good. Now we get to media. Highly sexualized images of women who exhibit passivity and dependency, still predominant. Male cartoon characters represented 4-1, usually use more physical aggression with while females are more likely to display behaviors that show us fear, acting romantic, being polite. Acting supportive is a big one. I mean, think of how many male cartoon characters, and that goes all the way back to the TV show The Honeymooners type thing, where it's like Peter Griffin's an idiot, Homer Simpson's an idiot. I mean, just on down the line, and yet their wives support them to the bitter end, being polite and doing so and just supporting them, even if they're just total idiots, right? So same thing in video games. Women are presented in hypersexualized ways, less likely to have playable female characters. Take some time to change that slowly, but even that is slowly changing. All right, let's take a look here at labor and gender. 1900, 1/5 of women were in the U.S. labor force. That has changed quite a bit. Today, 60% plus of women are in the U.S. labor force. More than half of U.S. married couples depend on 2 incomes and 3 incomes and 4 incomes beyond that. The income gap is closing. It's 77 cents to $1. I mean, but what that work does, or what work is done by the two sexes, remains very different. And when did 77%, when you want to attain true equality, when did that ever suffice? It doesn't. Still massive, to be considered massive statistical inequality in pay in other areas. We know the glass ceiling, right? That's the idea that you've got this ladder and there's a glass ceiling here. And although people who identify as the gender female can see those CEO positions, they can see those head of the company positions, those more power positions, they can't go through that, because even though it's sort of invisible, it exists. And it's been institutionalized, much like the barriers that we face on race are very much real things. So are these barriers that people face along the lines of gender. Structural adjustment programs oftentimes place a higher burden on women. Women oftentimes are forced to work in informal sectors, and then therefore find that because they're working in those more informal sectors, those jobs are considered less important. And then we find a greater marginalization of women as we look at those positions. Buyer-driven creates more competition amongst developing countries. Women are segregated into informal job sectors performing specific jobs. But if we look globally outside of the United States, women are more and more and more and more involved at greater and greater levels, and with jobs and positions that are more and more powerful, that have a greater deal of access and are more important, or considered to be more important. Obviously, that idea that it's flexible has been that historical piece. Well, you've got to work it somehow around childcare, and yet people who consider themselves the gender male don't have to think about such things. They just keep working, working, working. So that's kind of one of the reasons that temporary, seasonal, or flexible work, right, is a greater proportion is female. On the other hand, flexibility Producers shift risk onto workers. Many of those jobs, much of the risk that is transferred, whether that's in meat or food processing plants and places, whether that's in industrial type of scenarios, that risk is shifted not only onto workers, but continually shifted onto a great deal of people who consider themselves gender female as far as hazard in working. Look at these two things, articles that I've got attached: a gendered value chain approach to codes of conduct in African horticulture. And in formal sectors, we know that the majority of women, but what do those informal sectors look like? All right, gender pyramid: formal employment, informal employment, and reproductive work. And so we're seeing two, informal employment and reproductive work, being a great deal of where we're finding female jobs and that type of work sort of rooted as the base of it in this culture. And then less access, even though there is some overlap there, but less access into more formal employment. And again, these are all changing. Again, this is all changing, graduation rates, and just how we are seeing people who identify with the gender female excel and succeed on a greater level. So are women the minority? Well, we mentioned briefly before, minority, any category of people distinguished by physical or cultural differences that a society sets apart and subordinates. So yeah, women are the minority, not necessarily because of numerical numbers, because they comprise 51, 52% of the population, but because of power and access and subordination. That brings us to intersection theory, the analysis of the interplay of race and class and gender. And now you're talking about multiple dimensions of disadvantage. It's one thing to have gender be that. It's another thing to have race be that. It's another thing to have a third or fourth element contribute to those multiple dimensions of disadvantage. All right. Gender and violence, sexual assault, sexual harassment, domestic violence. Those are all things that are taken on heavily by people who identify with the gender female, and those populations of people at much, much greater risk. We know men purport and carry out 95 to 99% of all the violence in our culture. Disgusting and wrong in so many ways, and these need to be the ways in the areas that we absolutely consciously, because we have seen it is still the case. We are not going to turn this around on its own. We need to redefine this and have new norms and values and expectations, so that we don't push one gender exclusively into a situation where they're going to be the ones enacting all the violence. Genital mutilation, that's another piece there. And genital mutilation is what we formally call, what we sort of casually call circumcision. And that is a big part in the rest of the world, removing the clitoris so that sexual pleasure is much, much, much less. And then therefore, you know that that is something that is done by men to women. It shows dominance. It's abhorrent. And when we do it in this culture, we hardly think of it. We really don't pay it much mind. A majority of people, for non-religious reasons, and that's where circumcision started, non-religious reasons, getting caught up in that sort of in the system that costs extra many thousands of dollars, that can have traumatic, a lot of trauma repercussions for males later on, people identify the gender male later on in life. And it's something that we need to look at, having the same expectations that we have for females in this culture. We want to have the same expectations for males as well. And on that note, genital mutilation, which is a very serious note, but I'm going to leave it there, and we'll come back with one more episode for Chapter 10. Be good people and do good things, and do your part to define and redefine and add inclusivity and lower the amount of inequality that we associate with our gender roles, so we can get further together. Peace, everybody. Take care.